Hello, friend. Welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now, let's get into the story. The sun hung low over the school compound that Thursday afternoon, casting long shadows across the dusty walkways. The air buzzed with the usual end-of-day chatter, students clattering out of classrooms, teachers waving their goodbyes, but Ashabi's eyes were fixed on a girl near the science block, a girl laughing too easily, too comfortably with her boyfriend. Something inside her snapped. She didn't walk toward them, she stormed. Her steps were fast, her grip already tightening around the straps of her backpack. Without warning, she shoved the girl, a sharp thud of books scattering to the ground. Words were exchanged, sharp, ugly ones, and then came the slap. Ashabi didn't stop at one. The girl screamed as Ashabi clawed and hit and kicked, her fury pouring out in full view of a shocked crowd. It took two male prefects and a teacher to pull her off. The principal called her name twice before she even realized she'd been dragged into the staff room, her ears ringing, her chest heaving. And as she sat there, face set in defiance, the school knew this wasn't just another fight. It was the final straw. Ashabi had always been a troubled student, though no one could quite agree on why. Some said she was too entitled, too used to getting her way. Others whispered about her home, about how she never talked about her father, and how her mother looked tired even during PTA meetings. But Ashabi didn't care what they thought. She moved through school like a storm, brilliant in subjects she liked, cold in ones she didn't, and violent when pushed. Still, today's incident had crossed a line. The principal didn't waste words. There were no more warnings, no more suspensions. Just the word expelled and the click of the pen signing her dismissal letter. Her classmates watched from classroom windows as she walked to the gate, her shoulders squared, her face unreadable. But inside, her heart beat unevenly. Expulsion felt like something that happened to other people, not to her, not to Ashabi, who thought she had everything under control. She didn't go straight home. For nearly an hour, she wandered the streets near her neighborhood, dragging her feet, kicking at stones. The orange sky slowly gave way to the early evening blue, and the reality of her situation began to sink in like a slow ache. Her phone buzzed with messages, none from the person she wanted to hear from. Her palms felt sweaty. What would she tell her mother? The same mother who had warned her countless times, who barely had time to rest between two jobs, but still showed up at every school event with stern eyes and her scarf tied too tight. By the time she turned the corner into her street, her throat was dry. She paused just outside the compound gate, hand resting on the rusted iron, wishing she could turn invisible. Wishing, more than anything, that she had never let her anger speak for her again. The front door creaked open before she reached it. Balaji stood there, silent, waiting. And that was when Ashabi knew, today, nothing would be the same again. Balaji didn't speak at first. She simply stepped aside, letting her daughter enter the house like a shadow drifting through light. The living room smelled faintly of onions and dust, the curtains half drawn, the low hum of the evening news filtering through the silence. Ashabi dropped her bag by the door and stood there, waiting for the storm to come. Balaji closed the door quietly behind her. Then came the question, low, steady, too calm to be safe. "You fought again?" There was no answer, just a slow nod. And when Balaji heard the word expelled slip from her daughter's lips, something inside her cracked. She didn't scream, not immediately. She moved toward Ashabi in a blur, her hand finding the side of the girl's face with a slap so sharp it echoed off the walls. Ashabi didn't cry. She just stood still, eyes turned away, as Balaji unleashed her fury, words tumbling out faster than thought, hot and bitter. "After everything I do for you? After all the sacrifices?" She tore the phone from her daughter's pocket, threw it on the chair, and began to pace, one hand on her hip, the other clenching and unclenching like it didn't trust itself. The air in the room thickened with tension, the kind that didn't pass easily. Balaji's chest rose and fell with exhaustion, the kind that didn't just come from the body, but from years of shouldering too much alone. She had worked overtime that week, skipped lunch 3 days straight, all to make sure Ashabi's school fees were complete. And now, expulsion? She ran her hands over her face, over her head, sat briefly, then stood again. "Do you want to become useless?" she snapped. "Is that the plan? Is this how you repay me?" Her voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from holding back tears that would not fall. She didn't understand this child anymore, this angry, silent girl who fought with everyone and shrugged off every warning. Somewhere in her heart, Balaji had feared something like this was coming, but fear wasn't the same as readiness. She glanced at Ashabi, who now stood by the window, her face turned toward the darkening street. "No more phone," Balaji said finally, her voice hoarse. "No school. No outside. You'll stay in this house until you remember what it means to respect yourself." Later that night, the house was quiet, save for the soft clinking of a spoon in a teacup. Balaji sat alone in the kitchen, staring at nothing, the air filled with the scent of burnt rice she had forgotten on the fire. Regret didn't come easily to her, not when it came to discipline. She believed in structure, in consequences. But something about Ashabi's stillness after the slap, something about how she hadn't argued, hadn't begged, left a bitter taste. Balaji remembered her own mother's voice from years ago, sharp and final, and wondered if she sounded just like that now. In the silence, she looked toward the hallway, where Ashabi's door was shut tight. There was no sound from behind it, no crying, no protest. Just that heavy silence of someone who had gone far into herself. Balaji sighed deeply, but she didn't move. She simply reached for her cup, took a slow sip, and stared into the night. The next day, the knock on the door came late in the afternoon, just as the air began to cool, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the veranda. Balaji, still wearing the same wrapper from the night before, opened the door to find her younger brother, Femi, standing there with his usual boyish smile and a loaf of bread under one arm. He didn't need to ask for permission to enter. The door had always been open for him. He stepped in, glanced around the silent living room, and frowned. "Where's my girl?" he asked softly, setting the bread on the table. Balaji exhaled, weary beyond words, and motioned toward the hallway. "Inside," she said, voice flat, grounded. "No phone, no nonsense." Femi's brow creased, but he said nothing. He pulled out a chair, sat, and listened as Balaji relayed everything, the fight, the expulsion, the disrespect. She didn't raise her voice this time. Her tone was calm, but laced with frustration that ran deep. Femi nodded as she spoke, not interrupting, his fingers moving slowly over the rim of a plastic cup. When she was done, he stood, stretched his limbs, and walked to the hallway. "Let me talk to her," he said gently, disappearing into the corridor before she could argue. Ashabi didn't look up when he entered. She was curled on her bed, her back to the door, the faint blue light of dusk casting shadows on her wall. Her room smelled faintly of hair cream and sweat, the air stale from hours of silence. Femi didn't speak right away. He sat on the edge of the bed, waiting. Finally, he said, "You know, I once fought a boy in school because he tore my note." That made her turn slightly. Just a glance. "It wasn't a good fight," he continued, chuckling to himself. "He beat me. Badly. But that's not the point." He leaned forward. "What's happening with you, baby girl? You used to laugh with me. You used to draw those silly cartoons on my hand when I visited." Her eyes filled, but she blinked quickly. "Nobody understands," she muttered. "They just see me as trouble." Femi nodded. "Maybe. But trouble doesn't grow from nowhere. Something's bothering you, and instead of yelling at you, I'm here to listen." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old phone, one of those small, slightly cracked touchscreen types he no longer used. "Take it," he said, pressing it gently into her hand. "Just for emergencies. Don't let your mom catch you with it yet. But if you need to talk, I'm always here." She held it without answering, and for the first time in days, she whispered, "Thank you." That night, Shabby lay awake long after the house had gone quiet. Her room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the phone screen. Femi's contact was saved simply as Uncle F. Her thumb hovered above it, tempted to call him back to say more. But instead, her fingers scrolled to another number, the one name she couldn't forget. She hesitated only a moment before pressing dial. The call rang twice before he picked up. "Why are you calling me?" the voice snapped. "Don't call this line again." And then the line went dead. Just like that. Ashabi stared at the screen, the ache in her chest blooming too fast to contain. She bit her lower lip, pressed her face into the pillow, and wept quietly into the darkness. She didn't notice the time. She didn't care that the phone was warm against her palm. The only thing she felt was the hollow that came with being discarded. Not even anger, just that sinking grief of being unwanted. And for the first time, she wished she had never said a word to him at all. The days that followed crawled by slowly, like time had grown tired of rushing. Ashabi hardly left her room, except to use the bathroom or nibble at whatever Balaji forced onto her plate. Her appetite vanished. Her voice, once loud and fiery, shrank to barely a whisper. Even Femi noticed the change when he called her one evening, and she answered with only one-word replies before ending the call abruptly. Balaji, on her part, tried to stay firm. She thought the silence was guilt, thought the punishment was finally sinking in. But as the week deepened and Ashabi grew paler, her hands trembling even as she poured water into a cup, something shifted in Balaji's chest. One morning, as she watched Ashabi lean over the sink and retch for the third time in 2 days, her fear began to outweigh her anger. The girl's knees buckled, and Balaji rushed forward, steadying her daughter's body with arms that still remembered carrying her as a baby. There was no more room for suspicion, only urgency. That afternoon, they boarded a Kiki and made their way to the clinic, the journey silent save for Ashabi's shallow breathing and Balaji's pounding heart. The hospital was quiet, almost too clean, too white. Balaji sat beside her daughter in the waiting area, the metal chair cold against her back, her fingers rubbing unconsciously at the hem of her blouse. When the nurse called their name, Ashabi hesitated, looking up at her mother with eyes dulled by something beyond sickness. Inside the doctor's office, a brief consultation led to a series of tests. They were asked to wait again. Balaji tried not to imagine what could be wrong. Malaria, typhoid, even ulcer. She braced herself for anything routine. But when the doctor returned, file in hand, her expression was cautious. She asked Ashabi to step out for a moment. Balaji felt her throat tighten. And then the words landed, quiet but unrelenting. "Your daughter is pregnant." For a few seconds, Balaji didn't react. The word echoed, reshaping itself in her brain. She blinked once, then again. And when she finally looked up, it wasn't disbelief in her eyes. It was a stunned silence, heavy and vast, like the weight of her entire world had just shifted without warning. The breath left her body slowly. She stood up, but didn't know why. "Pregnant?" she repeated, as if it were someone else's child being discussed. Ashabi sat outside the room, curled up on the narrow bench, arms hugging herself. When Balaji stepped out, their eyes met, and in that instant, Ashabi knew her mother had heard. Her face crumpled, lips trembling. She didn't wait to be asked. She simply began to cry, openly, fully, like a dam had broken. But even then, she said nothing. Balaji didn't speak either. They walked out of the hospital side by side, the silence between them no longer sharp but aching. The street noise seemed distant, unreal, as they made their way home. That night, Balaji sat by the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. Her thoughts chased themselves in circles. Who? How? When? But more than anything, she felt failure creeping in, thick and unforgiving. She had tried so hard to raise her daughter right, to protect her, and yet here they were, two women, one too young, one too tired, carrying the weight of a truth neither was ready to confront. The evening air was heavier than usual. It wasn't the heat, it was something else, something unspeakable that clung to the walls of the house and made everything feel too still. Balaji sat at the dining table, her hands resting on the faded tablecloth, her eyes locked on Ashabi, who sat curled in the corner of the living room. The girl's eyes were swollen from crying, her lips trembling any time her mother looked her way. Balaji had asked once, softly, almost tenderly, who was responsible. Ashabi only shook her head. The silence after that was thick and loaded. Balaji hadn't pressed again, but her mind wouldn't let it rest. Her daughter hadn't been going out. She'd barely left the house since the expulsion. There were only so many people Ashabi had access to. And then the thought came, quiet at first, then louder. Femi. He had been close to her. Too close. He had gone into her room, comforted her, given her a phone. The timeline suddenly felt suspicious. Her stomach turned. She wanted to reject the thought, but it dug in deeper the more she tried to dismiss it. She heard his knock before she saw him. Femi's voice followed, cheerful, casual, calling out as he stepped into the compound. Balaji opened the door slowly, her face unreadable. Femi noticed her expression immediately, the way she leaned against the doorframe like she didn't trust her legs. "Is something wrong?" he asked, concerned. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside and let him enter. He walked into the living room, greeted Ashabi, who barely looked at him. When he turned to Balaji again, her eyes were filled with something new, something that made him uneasy. "Femi," she said slowly, voice brittle, "what have you done to my daughter?" His eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" She pointed at Ashabi, her voice rising. "She's pregnant, and she won't say who did it. But you were close to her. Always in her room, always whispering to her. So tell me now, Femi. Is it you?" Her voice cracked mid-sentence, but her anger refused to crumble. She advanced toward him, trembling. Femi's mouth fell open, stunned. "Balaji," he said, stepping back, "you think me?" His voice broke, not with guilt but with disbelief. "How can you even say that?" The room spun with silence. Ashabi's head lifted, her eyes now wide with fear. "Mummy, no," she cried, rushing between them. "Uncle Femi didn't touch me. He didn't do anything." But Balaji wasn't listening. Her voice came back, fierce and wounded. "Tell me the truth, Femi. Because who else? Who else has been here?" Femi grabbed her shoulders, not roughly, but to hold her still. "You think I would do that to you?" he asked. "To her?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Balaji, what happened to you?" Her eyes flickered then, something in them giving way. She collapsed into the nearest chair, breathing heavily. The walls she'd built for years finally cracked, and in a voice too tired to carry weight, she said, "It was Uncle Lazarus." Femi blinked, confused. "What?" She looked at him, eyes wet. "Mummy's brother. He did it to me. When I was young. I told her. She beat me, and I got pregnant." The silence was immediate, deafening. Femi sank into the chair opposite her, stunned. Ashabi's sobs filled the room again, but it was Bolaji's confession that hung in the air like smoke, dark and suffocating, refusing to be ignored. Femi sat frozen, the name Uncle Lazarus echoing through his skull like a dull, repeated thud. The room no longer felt like a familiar place. It was suddenly tighter, darker, colder. Across from him, Balaji kept her eyes on the floor, her fingers twisting into the hem of her wrapper like she was trying to hold herself together. The walls around her, carefully built over the years, had shattered with that one name. "I was 13, she whispered, the words jagged and dry. "He would come into my room whenever Mummy wasn't around, and even when I told her, she slapped me, called me a liar, said I was possessed." Her lips trembled as she exhaled. "When I found out I was pregnant, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't raise a child in that house. Not with her, not with him." Femi closed his eyes. He wanted to believe there had been some mistake, some mishearing. But everything about his sister's posture, defeated, small, but full of painful clarity, told him this was truth. His stomach turned. That same uncle had held him on his laps as a child, told him stories, bought him sweets. The betrayal stung with fresh venom. Femi rose slowly from the chair, his movements stiff. He paced the room, one hand dragging over his head, the other clenched into a fist. "And you've kept this all these years?" he asked, his voice strained. Bolaji didn't answer. Ashabi sat on the floor now, quiet, watching her mother with wide, tearful eyes. Femi looked at his niece and then back at his sister. "And she? Ashabi?" Bolaji nodded, a single, broken motion. "She's the child," she said. "She doesn't know. I've never had the strength to tell her." Her voice faltered. "I tried to protect her. I tried to raise her better than I was raised. But maybe I failed." Femi walked over and crouched beside her. "No," he said firmly. "You didn't fail. You survived. You kept her alive. You gave her a chance." He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "But Mummy, she knew?" Bolaji looked away. She pretended not to. Or maybe she really believed her brother was incapable of such things, but she chose him over me. Without another word, Femi stood and grabbed his car keys from the counter. His steps were swift, his purpose sharpened by fury. "Where are you going?" Bolaji asked, alarm in her voice. "Home," he replied. "To her. I need to hear what she has to say." Bolaji tried to rise, but sat back down, weak. "She'll deny it," she warned. Femi paused at the door. "Then let her try," he said quietly. "But not this time. This time, she'll listen." And with that, he left, the door slamming behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Bolaji sank into the cushion, eyes blank, heart beating slowly like a fading drum. Ashabi crawled beside her, laying her head on her mother's lap. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say, just the quiet recognition between a mother and daughter who for the first time saw each other fully. The hallway of the hospital was quiet, save for the distant beeping of machines and the muffled voices of nurses exchanging shifts. Femi stood near the doorway of the emergency unit, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes fixed on nothing. His shirt was wrinkled, sweat gathered at the base of his neck, and he hadn't sat since they brought Mama Janet in. She had not woken up during the drive or the rushed admission. A nurse had told him it was a mild heart episode brought on by stress, and that she was stable now, resting. Still, Femi couldn't relax. His chest ached with a tangle of emotions, anger, fear, frustration, and none of them knew where to settle. When the doctor finally emerged and gave him permission to see her, he stepped into the room with slow, careful steps. Mama Janet lay on the bed, her eyes closed, an oxygen tube beneath her nose, her frame smaller somehow, less fierce. For a moment he just looked at her, wondering how a woman with so much power in her voice could end up looking so fragile under the soft light of a hospital room. She stirred when he sat beside her, her eyes fluttering open with a slow blink. "Femi," she croaked, voice hoarse but clear. He reached for her hand but said nothing. The silence between them was louder now, filled with everything they hadn't said earlier. Mama Janet tried to sit up, but winced and sank back into the pillow. "Don't worry," Femi said finally, his voice low. "You're safe." Her gaze lingered on his face, and something unreadable flickered in her eyes. "Why did you come at me like that?" she asked. "You nearly drove me to the grave." Femi looked away, jaw tightening. "Because you hurt Balaji," he said. "You broke her spirit, and you refused to see it." She closed her eyes for a long moment. "I was trying to protect the family," she murmured. "What would people say if they heard such a thing about Lazarus?" Femi leaned forward, voice sharper. "So you protected your brother and sacrificed your daughter?" She didn't reply. A tear slid down the side of her face, disappearing into the creases near her ear. For the first time, Femi saw not the strong-willed woman who raised him, but a mother trapped in shame and denial, haunted by choices she couldn't reverse. It was well past midnight when they returned to Balaji's house. The taxi pulled into the compound with a quiet rumble, and Balaji came out to meet them, her wrapper tied firmly, worry etched across her face. She helped Femi ease their mother out of the back seat and into the house. No one spoke until Mama Janet was lying on the couch, covered with a light shawl. The air in the room felt like something had shifted, something broken had finally begun to mend, however slowly. "I'm sorry," Mama Janet whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of years. Balaji stood by the door, arms folded, watching her mother with eyes that had seen too much. "You let him touch me," she said softly but firmly. "You chose him, Mama, again and again." Mama Janet cried then, not loudly, but in the quiet way that sounded like regret. "I didn't know how to believe it," she said. "I didn't want it to be true." Balaji walked over, her steps hesitant, then knelt beside her mother. "And now?" she asked. Mama Janet reached for her hand and held it. "Now I know, and I'm so sorry." Femi watched them, his chest loosening for the first time in days. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. And sometimes that was enough. The next morning broke gently, with pale sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of Balaji's living room. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, broken occasionally by the soft creak of footsteps. Balaji sat alone at the dining table, cradling a cup of lukewarm tea, staring blankly at the tiled floor. Her mother lay on the couch still asleep, her breathing steady beneath the shawl. Femi was in the kitchen, silently washing a few plates, and the house, though filled with people, felt unusually calm. Balaji's mind wandered as steam curled up from her tea. For years, she had built her strength like armor, layered with silence, duty, and a kind of hardened pride. But now, that armor had cracked. She had spoken the truth, watched it land like thunder, and still, somehow, the sky hadn't fallen. She glanced toward her mother's resting form and felt something unexpected, not forgiveness, but a loosening of the tight, bitter knot in her chest. Pain was still there, but it no longer held her in its fist. Later that afternoon, Balaji made a quiet phone call to a counseling center one of her colleagues had once mentioned. She didn't know exactly what to say, how to explain the decades of buried trauma, or the heaviness that still lingered over her daughter's silence. But the woman on the line had a warm voice, the kind that didn't rush her, that offered words like, "There's no perfect time, only a willing heart." They set up a family therapy session for the following week. After ending the call, Balaji sat quietly by Ashabi's door for a long while before gently knocking and stepping in. Her daughter sat on the bed, holding a small shirt she'd sewn for the baby, her eyes tired but clear. Balaji sat beside her, unsure of how to start. "I didn't always know how to love you properly," she said, voice low. "But I want to learn. We both deserve better than pain." Ashabi didn't speak right away. Instead, she leaned into her mother's side, resting her head there, and for the first time in weeks, Balaji wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her close. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was honest. And that made it sacred. As days passed, the house began to feel lighter in small, almost invisible ways. Mama Janet insisted on preparing dinner one evening, ofaku, just the way Balaji liked it as a child. She moved slowly, pausing often, but her gestures were careful and filled with meaning. Femi helped her stir the pot, their quiet laughter returning in patches. Balaji watched from the doorway, arms folded, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. The past hadn't disappeared. It lingered still, but no longer screamed. The therapist, when they finally met, was gentle and firm. She asked questions that hurt, then healed. And gradually, mother, daughter, and grandmother began to piece together something new, something rooted not in silence or shame, but in truth. Ashabi continued to prepare for the baby's arrival, with Balaji often beside her, measuring fabric, folding clothes, touching her belly with cautious tenderness. Healing, Balaji realized, was not a single event. It was a slow, daily choice. And as the weeks rolled on, she made that choice again and again, not just for herself, but for the family she was learning to hold with grace. The final stretch of Ashabi's pregnancy came with quiet tension, the kind that settles softly but deeply, like dust on forgotten furniture. Each day bled into the next, with the rhythm marked by doctor's appointments, small body aches, and nights interrupted by frequent trips to the bathroom. Balaji kept a calendar on the wall, circling each week with a red marker, counting down the days while pretending not to. In truth, she was nervous, not just about the birth, but about everything that would follow. Sometimes she'd stand at the doorway and watch Ashabi sleep, her hands resting on her swollen belly, her breaths deep and even. And Balaji's heart would clench at the thought of her becoming a mother too soon. She worried if Ashabi would be strong enough, if she, Balaji, had prepared her well, if love, this time, would be enough to undo all the hurt that had come before. Outside the house, the world went on untouched. Market women still shouted their prices. Motorcycles zipped through narrow streets. Children played with sachets of water, bursting them like balloons under the sun. But inside the walls of Balaji's home, everything felt paused, like life was holding its breath. Mama Janet spent her mornings in the small garden, tending to the plants she had once neglected. She no longer barked orders or silenced conversations. Instead, she listened. Sometimes she'd tell stories from her youth, fragmented memories of her own mother, the way things used to be, and how she wished she could go back and make better choices. Ashabi listened quietly, nodding sometimes, but rarely speaking. Femi visited often, bringing fruits and laughing at his own jokes, trying to sprinkle levity into a house still learning how to smile. Though laughter wasn't abundant yet, there was peace. Not loud, not boastful, but present in the stillness, in the shared glances and warm bowls of food passed around the table. One particularly hot afternoon, Balaji helped Ashabi ease into a reclining chair on the veranda. They sat side by side, watching the street in silence. The baby kicked and Ashabi flinched slightly, placing her hand there with a faint smile. "Do you think I'll be a good mom?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Balaji turned, startled, not because of the question, but because it was the first time Ashabi had spoken of motherhood with anything other than dread. She reached over and covered her daughter's hand with her own. "I think you already are," she replied. "Because you care. And that's where it starts." Ashabi nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon where two boys chased a tire down the road. In that moment, nothing was perfect. The past still ached. The future was uncertain. But there was something solid forming between them, something real and lasting. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about learning to live, to build, to become. And as they sat there, quiet in their waiting, The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, as if even the wind knew something new was coming. It began just after midnight. A sharp cry woke Balaji from her light sleep, the kind of cry that carried no confusion, only urgency. She rushed into Ashabi's room to find her doubled over, her hands gripping the edge of the bed, sweat beading on her forehead. Her breaths came in short, shallow bursts, and for the first time in a long while, her eyes showed fear, not the kind she used to mask with anger, but the raw, trembling kind that only comes from stepping into the unknown. Balaji didn't panic. She wrapped a wrapper over her chest, called Femi, and within minutes, they were speeding toward the hospital under a sky thick with stars. The roads were mostly empty, the quiet of the city broken only by the occasional hiss of tires against tarmac. Balaji held Ashabi's hand the entire ride, whispering reassurance through clenched teeth, her own heart galloping as though it had to make up for both of them. She didn't let go, even as the nurses wheeled Ashabi away behind double doors that read maternity ward, no entry beyond this point. The weight felt eternal. Balaji paced the corridors, barefoot now, her wrapper loosened from too many tugs. Mama Janet arrived before dawn, her scarf tied in haste, eyes red-rimmed but steady. She sat beside her daughter in silence, occasionally whispering prayers under her breath. Femi returned with hot tea none of them drank. And then, just as the sky outside began to warm into morning, a nurse stepped out, smiling. "She's fine. The baby, too. You can see her soon." Balaji didn't wait. She moved like the ground beneath her had shifted. Inside the dim hospital room, Ashabi lay pale but glowing, her arms wrapped around a tiny bundle of brown flesh and fluttering breath. She looked up as Balaji entered, her face soft with exhaustion and wonder. "It's a girl," she whispered. "She's so small." Balaji knelt beside the bed, eyes fixed on the baby's face. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, reaching out with trembling fingers, she stroked the baby's cheek and said, "She's strong. Just like you." Ashabi smiled through her tears. "I want to name her Amoli." "Light," she said, "because I don't want her to grow up in shadows." The days that followed moved gently, like water trickling over stones. Ashabi returned home with Amoli wrapped tightly to her chest, and the house that once echoed with tension now breathed differently. Laughter, tentative at first, returned to the rooms. Mama Janet hummed lullabies as she cooked, her voice less sharp, her presence less commanding. Femi came every evening, cradling Amoli like something precious, joking that he had finally found someone who didn't talk back. Balaji, now both mother and grandmother, moved with quiet purpose, cleaning, folding tiny clothes, learning how to bottle feed, and most of all, sitting beside Ashabi in moments of doubt. It came in soft, persistent moments, shared night watches, quiet meals, honest conversations. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined them. And in that small home, where once silence had lived like a tenant, joy began to find its footing again, not loud, not demanding, but sure and lasting. A new chapter had begun, and for the first time in a long while, Balaji wasn't afraid to turn the page. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.